Hi, I'm going to be reading Pandemic and Its Metaphors, Sontag Revisited in the COVID-19 Era by David Craig. This is a piece that explores both the similarities and differences between the current pandemic and the AIDS pandemic. On 24 May 2020, the New York Times published a list of 1,000 names of the 100,000 U.S. victims of COVID-19, taking up the entirety of its front page. The list included brief descriptions that reflected upon the victims' individual characters, with phrases like, "was never afraid to sing and dance," and "emergency room doctor who died in his husband's arms." The cover of the paper resembled a black and white photo of a mass gravesite taken from the vantage point of a drone, delivering as much semiotic and visual symbolism as it did effective insight into the lives of victims who, as the pandemic rages, may never receive a proper burial. The list was subtitled, "They Were Not Simply Names on a List, They Were Us." 30 years prior, the New York Times ran a similar story about, quote, "AIDS costing 100,000 U.S. lives," end quote. Here, the word costing signifies epidemic mortality as a line item on a business ledger. By the time of this story in 1991, a decade had passed since the onset of the disease. This illuminates the stark differences between the current airborne pandemic and the blood and body fluid-borne one with regards to their scale, speed, and means of infection. But it's also the form and placement of the story that further contrasts media discourses of both epidemics. The AIDS story ran deep within the paper on page 18 as an Associated Press article, without a byline and without victims' names. Throughout the first decade of the AIDS crisis, the New York Times had a terrible record of covering the epidemic. As Rosenzweig described, the coverage was, quote, "sparse and far from dependable, as much a testament to the pervasive cultural prejudices of the time as they are study and bias-born editorial neglect," end quote. For years, the paper rarely acknowledged AIDS as a cause of death. Even in the obituaries where grieving gay partners were referred to euphemistically as longtime companions. As Gross accounted in Up from Invisibility, quote, "not only is the stigma removed from the cause of death, but so is the stigma of gay identity," end quote. The semiotics, meaning, and metaphors about AIDS are thrown into stark relief when juxtaposed with the rhetoric surrounding COVID-19. Whereas coronavirus is figured as a global blight afflicting all of humanity, the media discourses at the peak of the AIDS crisis signified the opposite. They were not commemorated as names on a list, and they were definitely not us. In the early decades of the pandemic, AIDS was mostly invisible, a disease to be discursively stigmatized, shunned, and shamed, as critical theorist Susan Sontag brilliantly argued. In her pre-AIDS polemic Illness as Metaphor, written after surviving cancer, and then in AIDS and Its Metaphors, Sontag described how metaphoric language about different illnesses and the political and medical response to them are inextricably entwined. As Aristotle defined in Poetics, metaphors refer simply to, quote, "a name that belongs to something else," end quote. For Sontag, in the context of AIDS, the use of the plague and pollutant metaphors signified the political weaponization of disease and the diseased, and particularly those afflicted by an illness of unknown origin that was infecting segments of society already deemed pariahs. Sontag detailed how metaphors for illness both shame and blame, cursing the afflicted who in turn avoid treatment, or more often have treatment withheld. The stigmatizing power of metaphor has fatal consequences. Per Sontag, quote, "metaphor and myths, I was convinced, kill," end quote. In her treatise, Sontag described how military metaphors are abundant in discourses of plagues, including AIDS. So too now with COVID-19. Donald Trump, America's, quote, "wartime president," unquote, delivers his briefing surrounded by a, quote, "task force," end quote, that includes his impotent, quote, "surgeon general," end quote, while he engages in a war of words with journalists. The Pentagon flies synchronized fighter jets, absurdly named Blue Angels and Thunderbirds, to offer tribute to a nation still at war with both viruses and words. Leaders around the world have marched into symbolic step, into the discursive breach of yet another global pandemic. Francis Macron declares that we are at war, yet the battle cry is less charge than retreat inside one's homes. These military commands proliferate with phrases like stay at home, shelter in place, and with mandates for self-isolation. These are policy metaphors strategically designed to valorize self-reliance and the integrity of the private home, instead of the more suspect quarantine, a term that conjures up imprisonment for Americans who suffer from idealized conceptions of freedom. COVIDian military metaphors marshal us to valorize frontline workers, those deemed essential to the medical, economic, social, and of course, political establishment. These laborers vary from sanitation and restaurant workers to the gig employees delivering food, risking their lives for tips, and to the medical workers. The latter receive nightly tributes of applause delivered from anonymous citizens across urban balconies, spread and shared across broadcast and social media. These celebrations appear less like victory parades than outtakes from the Hunger Games, thundering huzzahs that claim to value workers even as bureaucracies strip medical laborers of vital battle gear. The term is personal protective equipment, or PPE, which is an acronym that operates like a metaphor. Only in this instance, it can save lives. Metaphors not only kill, they survive. What was once referred to as gay cancer, a term used to not only describe but stigmatize, persisted in press and political discourses even after the epidemiologists renamed it acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Although Reagan went years without uttering the word AIDS, his press secretary would joke about the gay plague with journalists in the same room where Trump now conducts his daily COVID briefings. Journalists and scientists wasted time and resources pursuing AIDS cofactors in gay sex practices, long after the disease was also found in additional populations. In 1986, the Los Angeles Times declared that, quote, the new AIDS research stirs concerns over poppers, end quote, the terms for odorants often used by gay men as aphrodisiacs. 15 years later, despite the discovery of the retrovirus causing the disease, scientists were still investigating the, quote, poppers HIV connection, unquote. In the AIDS age, Foucauldian biopower worked its magic to demonize a minority, although pandemics, metaphors, media, and Puritanism were bedfellows long before the stigmatization of fellows who shared their beds. In the wake of cholera outbreaks in New York City in 1866, the New York Times described the disease as, quote, the curse of the dirty, the intemperate, and the degraded, end quote. But the scourge of AIDS discourses were, like religious stigmata, symbolically transmuted into the lesions of Kaposi sarcoma on the flesh of AIDS victims. No such embodiment of disease has been made visible in the media spectacles of the coronavirus, with the exception of neon-colored body bags. These incongruous and anonymizing images render victims less like plague sufferers piled into mass graves and more like a fashion line launched by a disco of fitness courtiers. While the malignant discourses about AIDS were just the latest in a long lines of moral panics masked as epidemiology, in COVID-19 we depart from Sontag's script. The coronavirus victims are often less shamed for their sexual practices or their deficient hygiene, with the notable exception of how Wuhan wet markets were described as coronavirus incubators. After all, in the earlier stages of the disease, it was the elite and cosmopolitan set in our deeply globalized world who were most visibly afflicted. Rather, as symbolized by the New York Times, the dead are not just names, but us. The valorization of victims on the front page belies the demographic analysis within, which details how victims of the disease are patently not equal. Rather, much like AIDS, the virus takes a greater toll on the weak, the old, and the already marginalized. There is a familiar trajectory with the victims of both diseases. Much as AIDS once struck urban white middle-class gay men, today it more readily affects people of color. COVID-19 has progressed accordingly, if more rapidly, due to its virality, to affect those least likely to afford to quarantine, much less to fly or cruise. These victims overpopulate the sanitation crews and housekeeping, public transportation, trucking, warehouse, and childcare services deemed essential, if also tragically expendable. As expressed in this lengthy Los Angeles Times headline, quote, "Institutional racism, inequity fuel high minority death tolls from coronavirus," LA officials say, end quote. With COVID-19, race, place, and class are cause factors that have exposed the structural inequality and fault lines with society driven by late and global capitalism, which is overwhelming for language and even metaphor to describe. Perhaps the most apt metaphor might be the social mirror flu. In the age of social media with content and commentary proliferating across streaming portals and network platforms, perhaps Sontag might have found relief from the hegemony of political discourse limited to the handful of gatekeeping national media outlets ruling air and print in the mid-1980s. Alternatively, she may have been as frightened by the scale and spread of disinformation as she was disease and its metaphors. Indeed, the latest pandemic in the age of pan-media has solicited fears of pandemonium, if especially amongst critical cultural scholars, including this author. In writing both books with evangelical zeal, Sontag was attempting a cultural intervention. "My aim was to alleviate unnecessary suffering," she said. But Sontag was not alone in turning her pen against poisonous discourse. Around the same time, Tony Kushner was writing Angels in America, a brilliant attempt in the midst of pandemic to advocate for the progress of humanity. In the final monologue, the central protagonist, Prior Walter, delivers a talk on the fate of the world after the passing of the AIDS crisis. He says, "This disease will be the end of many of us, but not nearly all. And the dead will be commemorated and will struggle on with the living, and we are not going away. We won't die secret deaths anymore. The world only spins forward. We will be citizens." Spun forward now 3 decades, and the AIDS crisis has not fully passed, although it is now passed over by media attention. Even with all the advances of medicine around diagnosis and treatment, AIDS infections continue to increase, with 1.7 million new infections globally, including in Europe in 2019. Even with prevention in the age of PrEP, AIDS is spreading. PrEP means pre-exposure prophylaxis and describes how AIDS medications can lower the risk of HIV infection. Here, pharmaceutical acronyms operate as metaphors for risk avoidance behavior that but a few privileged white urban gay men have access to or dare to use. In queer positive parlance, PrEP is for sissies. As Camus described in his great plague novel, quote, "But what does it mean, the plague? It's life, that's all," end quote. For those AIDS-affected populations, whether vilified or rendered invisible through these discourses, their lives seem to matter little to the rest of the world. There was one notable exception. AIDS activist Larry Kramer turned language, narrative, and media into a weapon. Through his AIDS-themed commentaries, books, and plays, Kramer used metaphor to deliver prophetic, searing indictments of the government, medical establishment, and his own gay community. The title of Kramer's The Normal Heart is derived from the poem September 1, 1939 by W.H. Auden, in which he entreats us to, quote, "love one another or die," end quote. Tragically, Kramer died on the day this piece was written, 27 May 2020, but only after surviving AIDS for decades. Sontag died in 2004 of leukemia after having beaten cancer twice. Now here we are, literally and metaphorically, in the midst of yet another global pandemic. We are in dire need of Sontag's incisive polemics and Kramer's angry indictments, if also Kushner's optimistic rhetoric. Because even as the world appears to have spun backwards, language has the means to convey hope that it will one day spin forward again. This has been Kathleen Battles for This Way Out Radio.